Welcome back to everybody. And now let me introduce you Professor Mauro Carbone. He is a full professor at Jean Moulin University of Lyon. Within the conference Phenomenology and Digital Knowledge, he will now give a lectio magistralis titled Relearning to See the Screens, Pandemics, Effects, and the Phenomenological Epoche. Thanks, Mauro Carbone, for being with us today. And please.
Good morning, good evening, everybody. Let me thank very warmly Professor Luca Taddio and Dr. Floriana Ferro and Dr. Silvia Capodivacca and all the staff which is the crew of the organizers of this conference. Thank you very much for inviting me for this lectio magistralis, which really honors me. And a particular thank I'd like to address to my friend, Professor Graziano Lingua of the University of Turin, who discussed with me all the passages of my presentation. So the title is Relearning to See the Screens, Pandemic Effects and the Phenomenological Epoche. It was March 5th, 2020, and Italy had already fallen into the COVID-19 emergency when during an online video forum, I heard the Italian writer Alessandro Baricco suggested considering the COVID-19 pandemic as the first major crash test of the digital era. At the end of the same month, the New York Times published an article which sketched out an initial interim assessment of how, in the meantime, our relations to the most emblematic technological component of the dawn of digital era, namely screens, had changed. The title of this article sounded doubtless. Coronavirus ended the screen time debate, screens won. Amid other statements, the article reported a meaningful allegation by the techno-repentant psychologist Sherry Turkle, who 9 years earlier had denounced our technologically alienated condition in her book Alone Together, and 4 years earlier in Reclaiming Conversation had pleaded with us to talk to each other instead of staring at our cell phones. Well, in the light of the perpetually lit screens in lockdown times, Turkle admitted that the concern over the time spent facing that light was a misplaced anxiety, and found that now, forced to be alone but wanting to be together, so many are discovering what the screen time should be. Actually, in the same period, I received from my daughter, who lives in Italy, a WhatsApp picture showing her Aperol Skype during the coronavirus lockdown. And I asked myself, didn't this screen experience account exactly for the conversation Turkle had hoped for? 2 days before, on the newspaper Il Manifesto, the Italian philosopher Maurizio Ferraris announced the birth of what he baptized as post-colonial studies. This phrase suggested me not only an invitation to think of what would happen after the coronavirus crisis, but also seemed to me an extraordinary opportunity to cast a retrospective glance on what had happened before this crisis, namely during the previous 30 years of digital revolution, that is, since the beginning of the spread of the internet at the beginning of the 90s. 30 years of digital revolution that increasingly reshaped our life world. In other words, differently from a simple laboratory designed crash test, as Baricco suggested, whose task is to verify context-specific provision, my feeling was that the shock of the pandemic had provoked an unexpected sort of phenomenological epoche, forcing us, force is precisely, to force is precisely the verb Sherry Talcott used in her statement for the New York Times, forcing us to reconsider the changes that the previous 30 years had produced in our daily lives, particularly on our relations with screens. In this sense, relearning to see our screens anew in a sort of phenomenological epoche, forcing us to put into brackets our usual unreflected attitude with respect to the screens themselves. This is the meaning of my title and what I am trying to develop in this lectio magistralis. Obviously, we cannot know neither for how long the effects of such an epoche will last, nor which will be their consequences. In some ways, the shock seemed to have already turned into habit. This makes even more important to take notice of some most relevant features of our relations with screens that have emerged so far. First one, thanks to the screens, we no longer just share snapshots of our meal before even tasting the food, but we eat it together, like in the WhatsApp picture I showed before. This is an example of what made Tarkov say that we were discovering, and I stress this verb, discovering what the screen time should be. My question is, and yet the technological possibility of spending our time that way, eating together, for instance, was already available. Why didn't we exploit this possibility before? I feel it is culturally relevant to question the reasons behind this. Could it not be the case that the problem resides in our old metaphysical prejudice, according to which we think we can separate the reality from what we consider as illusion, and we call from time to time appearance the imaginary or the virtual? Plato's cave, in this sense, is the quintessential allegory precisely of this metaphysical prejudice. And this prejudice is really very hard to remove. Let me show you this video, a French video titled The Trap of Images, which has been realized 10 years ago, and it seems a much longer time, because you see in this video, like in Plato's cave, you find the ancestral fear of remaining imprisoned by screens. Ne laissons pas nos enfants se faire piéger par les images. So once again, like for Plato, images are supposed to be a trap. And there is another writing very interesting for our proposals. Soyons tous responsables face aux écrans. So we should be all responsible in front of screens. Screens were supposed to be the cause of problems with childs and so on. Things are totally changed 10 years later. And my question is, after various pandemic lockdowns, will us return to the idea of screens understood as cave walls or of prisons bound to lock us in a trap of images, hence excluding us for the from the so-called reality? This is a key question. But let's go on. Second point, as our experience during lockdowns taught us, screens are not and never were simple surfaces for showing or hiding portions of the visible, in order perhaps to trap us as our magical pre-modern attitudes toward the pictures, according to Mitchell's phrase, continue to make us fear. Think of the hedgerow that the Italian poet Giacomo Leopardi observed from the hill evoked in his poem The Infinite. To me, this lonely hill was always precious, and this hedgerow also, were so wide a sketch of the extreme horizons out of sight. But sitting here and gazing, I find that the endless spaces beyond that edge, and more than human silences, and the deepest peace and quiet are fashioned in my thought. So much that almost my ear fills up with fear. So the hedgerow here works as an interface, distributing the visible and the invisible, as well as founding the poet's relation with the invisible, the infinite, in a way that protects his heart from being completely flipped up with fear. And this is very interesting because we can see a double function of screens emerging from this poem, the visual function, but at the same time the protection, the immunitarian function of the screen. Like this hedgehog, in every age, screens have always operated in a certain historically, culturally, and technologically variable distribution of the visible and the invisible, exposing us to that distribution and at the same time protecting us from its exceeding reach. In any case, screens would on each occasion establish relations and thus allow or prevent actions and anyway found mediated experiences. In short, rather than being mere surfaces, screens have always functioned as interfaces, if that is what the verb relating implies. And my reference here is to the book of Brandon Ookway, Interface, in which you can read that the interface may be distinguished from the surface in that it does not primarily refers back to a thing or condition, but rather to a relation between things or conditions, or to a condition as it is produced by a relation, end quote. Third point, still about screens as interfaces, we should specify that with the electronic and later on digital revolution, screens have gradually become the main interfaces of devices, allowing us to communicate with others and with the world. In the meantime, such devices have been technologically developed in a multimodal sense, by combining in multiple ways texts, images, sounds, and including looks, gestures, voices, as well as tactile operations. This multimodal development of screens is subject today to growing momentum. Example, the increasing diffusion of the cultural products that are designed to be listened to through devices equipped with touch screens, such as audiobooks, podcasts, ASMR videos, and or a most recent example, the popular Clubhouse app, namely a voice-based social network. And to stress this point, I show you this picture. It's the picture illustrating an article titled precisely ASMR videos are the biggest YouTube trend you have never heard of. Such screens appear as the main arena of an epochal process of hybridization of the aforementioned means of expression. Words, moving images, fixed images, and tactile operations. And this is the reason why this phenomenon demands to be understood via a new transdisciplinary approach. Obviously, this is the fourth point. The cultural delay mentioned in the first point does not concern just our collective experience. I give you another example now, the example of the screen studies. Spurred in their development precisely by the digital revolution, certain screen studies have been focusing mainly on the screen's status of surfaces showing images, hence investigating them by means of archaeological and genealogical researches, both suggestive and erudite, but often not equally helpful in the understanding of what characterizes the current or upcoming screen experience, and of how they affect our way of being in the world. Those screen genealogies are mainly focused on the bond between the screen and the optical, in connection with the emergence of spectacles like phantasmagoria, early 19th century. Thus, such genealogies turn out being subordinated to an imagocentric perspective and turn out neglecting other fundamental screens features. Let's read, for instance, more than a century earlier with respect to the phenomenon of phantasmagoria, on which screen studies are often focused. Let's read, for instance, one of the first dictionaries of the French language. You see the edition of 1694 of Pierre Richelet, Dictionnaire François contenant les mots et les choses, plusieurs nouvelles remarques sur la langue françoise. This is the way they wrote this word at that time. The definition of the word écran is very interesting because as you can read in the lower part of my slide, the screen was defined as what you hold in your hand and put in front of your face so as to protect it from a big fire. Once again, the protective function of screens. What you put in front of you to prevent the fire from hurting you. This kind of screen is called a foot screen, to distinguish it from the ones you hold in your hand. A beautiful screen, a pretty screen. Screens are usually decorated with paintings, poems, stories, tales. This is the French definition in this dictionary, and the expressions we read in this definition are extremely interesting because they show how these screens, while maintaining the function of exposing people to fire and protecting them from its excesses, also exploited their showing function to display not only images, despite the imagocentric perspective of screen studies, but also words. Thus, these screens already provided us a hybrid experience, words and images together, showed on surfaces supposed to protect us. So an hybrid experience closer to the current one than it could be suspected. Fifth point, even certain visual cultural studies were not able to actually grasp and point out the status of our screens as interfaces featured on multimodal relationship devices. Thereby, too often such studies have focused on a narrow understanding of visuality and its mutations. Why I say I am qualifying this perspective as a narrow understanding of visuality. On the one hand, because such visual studies isolated this area of investigation from the complementary domain concerning the parallel mutations taking place in our relations with the language, both written and spoken, which led to a resurgence of words. This is a phrase I take from Kevin Kelly, the founder of the journal Wired, who used this phrase in his book, The Inevitable. In other terms, even such visual culture studies have mainly considered the screens as surfaces that show or hide those portions of the visible we call images, as if the written words they convey were not in their own right a modulation of the visual space, as Merleau-Ponty pointed out already in Phenomenology of Perception, and as if writing was not moving toward a syncretism pointed out, the syncretism, pointed out by Pietro Montani to indicate the increasing integration of still and moving images, as well as orality and other sounds in a sort of expanded way of writing, which is the way of writing, putting words and icons together that we usually practice in our text messages, for instance. On the other hand, starting from the restricted consideration of screens as mere surfaces showing images, such visual studies moved in a purely imagocentric perspective, engaging in rather thoughtless leaps forward to predicting which visual device would supplant the screens themselves, and inevitably ending up find this improved visual device in VR devices, which isolate us from the physical world. And this is a prediction very old, because we can find this prediction already in Lev Manovich, The Language of New Media, published in 2021. Sorry about that. Manovich wrote, with VR, the screen disappears altogether. VR typically uses a head-mounted display whose images, once again, you see the imagocentric perspective of this point of view about screens, whose images completely fill the viewer's visual field. No longer is the viewer looking forward at a rectangular flat surface located at a certain distance, and which acts as a window into another space. Now she is fully situated within this other space. So you see in this passage from Manovich the imagocentric perspective I am criticizing here. The idea is that screens would be just surfaces showing images. If we find a more improved way of of experience images like VR helmets, the screen will disappear altogether. This is the way of thinking in a very incorrect and too short way, which is still at stake in many visual culture studies today. And in my opinion, the phenomenological epoche provoked by the COVID-19 pandemic show us that screens are something very different from this characterization that visual culture studies still propose us. So herein lies the risk of considering screens exclusively from the perspective of images, as film director like Steven Spielberg and Alejandro González Iñárritu do when they identify the overcoming of the cinematic frame, the window mentioned by Manovic, with the end of a screen as such. 6, a vision of screens developed not from the perspective of a film director, but from that of people confined in their homes at the time of a pandemic, has hence helped us to put into brackets that point of view, the imagocentric point of view, and distinguish it from the point of view we usually address to the screens via which we communicate in our daily lives. Our present point of view, the point of view we usually address to our screens in our daily life consists in looking at the images, of course, but at the same time in reading words, but also watching words and reading images, as Kevin Kelly once again writes in his book, The Inevitable. So, although not imagocentric, Kelly's description is likely to appear oculocentric or visiocentric, that is, such as to reduce a broader number of screens functions altogether consisting in their mediation of human relations and actions to the mere visual field, albeit expanded to include the texts as well as images. So this seems to be Kelly's attitude, not an imagocentric attitude, but a visiocentric attitude extended to words. Nevertheless, Kelly highlights that in his own acceptation, the verb screening, which he points out as one of the 12 that define the typical trends of the digital era, designates a new activity, which has new characteristics. So not at all a mere visual activity, despite what we read previously. Also, Kelly declares that it is likely that just as it seemed weird 5 centuries ago to see someone read silently, in the future, he wrote, It will seem weird to watch a screen without some part of our body responding to the content. This last statement is very interesting for two different reasons. First of all, the peculiar acceptation proposed by Kelly concerning the verb screening does not seem to imply a reduction of the visual field, but rather a more general involvement of our bodily experience. However, what strikes is that Kelly announces such a bodily involvement as a forthcoming novelty in the future, he writes. While what I mean to point out here is that this bodily involvement has already has always been a fundamental, or better still, foundational component of our relations toward screens. As concerning this bodily involvement of our experience of screens, let me show you this wonderful video showing in which sense our body is the proto-screens. So the discovering of one's own shadow as an image produced by one's own body. So the body in this sense is the screen, screening out the light of the sun and producing the shadow. Let's say it in phenomenological language. As a corpore, namely a body object, and as such visible, my body can intercept the light source and be seen, thus exposing itself to the live, living body of anyone who can see, while hiding what is immediately behind it, thus implicitly protecting it from their view. So you see, I tried to emphasize different functions which are produced by our body as visible. At the same time, my visible body, precisely by intercepting that source of light, screens it and projects a dark smudge into a surrounding surface, which in turn shows it. In that smudge, my own body, as alive, able to see, will recognize its shadow. So, this ambiguity of the body, I am echoing in an intentional way Merleau-Ponty's jargon. This ambiguity of the body as both visible and viewing is inscribed within a broader synesthetic ambiguity of being both sensible and sentient, which in turn further highlights the mutual implication of the screen functions of showing and hiding with those of exposing and protecting. Indeed, the shadow itself is a highly synesthetic phenomenon, so not just a visual phenomenon, but a synesthetic phenomenon. The dark smudge it projects can become a space of protection from the excess not only of light, but also of heat. Seventh point, the very fact of looking at screens from the pandemic perspective has allowed us to relearn to see the function evoked already in the etymology of the word screen, which Leopardi himself implicitly echoed in the infinite. That is to say, the meaning of protecting. The French and Italian versions of the word screen and fencing have, not by chance, the same etymon, schermijn. So we found this function, this screen's function of protecting in multiple occasions during the pandemic, the lockdowns period. This is a very famous picture showing what was called a hug room in Italy last year, but in France last year and this year we can find posters inviting us to use barrier gestures such as coughing or sneezing in the crook of our elbows, thus revealing that the protective function is performed first of all by our bodies, which hence affirm even in this way their status as proto-screens. So once again, screens exceed the mere visual dimension and mediate our overall bodily relationship with the environment, or to say it with the German biologist von Uexküll, Umwelt. 8. The English newspaper The Guardian in May 2020 published an article by the journalist and activist Naomi Klein prospecting a capitalistic screen New Deal after the pandemic that is, I quote her, a living laboratory for a permanent and highly profitable no-touch future. I stress the expression no-touch future for the privileged. This is another quotation that I would like to stress, provided this living laboratory by a further screens proliferation. So we are speaking now about our near future, and Naomi Klein speaks of our probable near future in these terms. Indeed, it seems likely to think that in the years to come, strategic, political, economic, technological choices will be made, no doubt socially discriminatory, which will preferably focus on screens to allow forms of communication, labor communication, medical health, commercial, educational, related, and so on, protected by the direct and indirect physical contact with other human beings. What Naomi Klein called a permanent and highly profitable no-touch future. And by the way, let me flag to you that contactless screens are becoming more and more frequent in our experience, in our present experience, but also will be more frequent in our next future. Indeed, during the digital revolution, screens have become tactile. Still, the pandemic has raised the issue of human contact, namely of touching. This is why we are now recovering experimentations held 6 years ago and concerning touchless touch screens. The screen will figure out which part of it we wish to touch by detecting the heat and sweat of our fingers. All we need to do is to drive our hands closer to the screen. No need to touch it. In 2015, none thought this device particularly useful. Evidently, this urges to make the hypothesis that, as far as social practices are concerned, the consideration of our mutual physical distance could show signs of mutation destined to sediment. 9. For the reasons set out above, I believe it is both important and urgent to develop a transdisciplinary research focusing on the study not of screens, but of our present and forthcoming multimodal screen experiences, in the conviction of their persistent centrality and their decisive influence on the wider range of our social interactions. Indeed, it is impossible to study screens without accounting for what we experience as intentioned as screens. In this sense, it is also impossible to study screens without accounting for the relations that our screen experiences involve and for the function that whatever operates as a screen assumes within such relations. This implies the importance of a pragmatics of the screen experiences, which hence needs to assume a relational approach by focusing not only on the visual aspects of such experience, but also on their overall bodily, communicational, and performative implications. The switch will hence be from an objectual to a functional understanding of screens, an understanding that will imply recognizing that the screens work as a peculiar quasi-subject, as such featuring no less peculiar perceptual affective characteristics, which of course are historically, culturally, and technologically variable. 10, the last point. It seems to me that the sort of phenomenological epoche this pandemic emergency has produced on our consideration of screen experiences has allowed us to realize that seeing them from the standpoint of cinema and media studies, as well as those of literature of aesthetics, induces the risk of missing some of their most crucial elements, which are decisively shaping the development of our anthropological structure. For this reason, I feel that any attempts to retrace screen archaeologies or genealogies cannot be separated from the elaboration of what could rightly be defined as an anthropology of screens, or rather as an anthropology of screen experiences to be included in the broader perspective of a paleontology of screens, suggested by W.J.T. Mitchell. Concerning the need of such an anthropology and its possible links with a related genealogy of the screens, let me recall what Michel Foucault stated about the diagnostic task a genealogy should develop. As he believes it happens in philosophy starting from Nietzsche. I quote Foucault, what we are today. What is this today in which we live? Such a diagnostic activity entailed the work of excavation beneath his, namely Nietzsche, own feet, in order to establish how this world of thought, of discourse, of culture, which was his world, had been formed before him. It seems to me that Nietzsche had ascribed to philosophy a new objective which has been somewhat forgotten, even though Husserl, in the crisis of European sciences, in his turn attempted a genealogy. With respect to the anthropology of the screen experiences that I am proposing here, to relearn to see the screens is to make the effort of allowing the sedimentation of the precious teachings of a somewhat collective phenomenological epoche before these teachings gradually begin to fade away, in order to put them at the service of the genealogical perspective, taking on the contemporary condition and developing consequent critical implications, as indeed phenomenology itself always wished. Meanwhile, the Screen New Deal is upon us. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Carbone. And now we have some time for questions and answers time. So if there are questions from the public, please raise your virtual hand if you are connected via Zoom, or write it down in the chat if you are on YouTube. I think that you can pose questions in English, in Italian, or in French. Professor Carbone, is it fine for you?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. I also have a question for you. Do you want it in Italian or in English? How do you prefer it?
I think the public is preferring. There is no problem for me.
Okay. I think the public is Italian. So, Floriana, I also ask you, what do you think about it? Shall we do it in English or in Italian?
No, it's better in English because I had requests also from the international public.
Ah, okay,
so
okay.
It's
Perfect.
better to speak English.
Okay.
Okay, good to know. So my question is very simple, and actually I really want to thank you for your very interesting and topical talk in a way, because it showed us how much the screens are important nowadays, and effectively you showed us in how many ways we can interpret the word screens. And at a certain point of your talk, you also spoke about the virtual reality devices, saying that in a way they are giving up with the screens because the reality they are showing is like more immersive than in front of a flat screen, a two-dimensional screen. Actually, I know that there are some platforms like Netflix, but also Amazon Prime, for example, that are joining these virtual reality devices to give to their customers an immersive experience. But what is important and in a way interesting in this kind of service that they are giving is that when you put on your VR device, what you can get when you connect to Netflix or to Amazon Prime is an experience like that you can have at the cinema. Meaning that in a way, even if there is no more a screen traditionally understood, anyway, they are repeating and they are reproducing a screen. Okay, so the customer can simulate to be at the cinema and again in front of a screen. So I think that this kind of service that they are offering in a way can suggest us that a screen would be anyway needed for a public to show up some images. But I wanted to know if you agree with it or not.
I absolutely agree, and I thank you very much for your question. When my book, Philosophy Screens, was just published, someone suggested me to go to visit the VR installation of Alejandro González Iñárritu in Milan from Prada Foundation, titled Carne y Arena, saying, you published a book about screens, but screens will disappear in a few years. When I experienced this installation of Alejandro González Iñárritu, at some point I tried to watch my hands, and I couldn't, because the VR helmet gave me a 360 visual horizon, but at the same time was hiding what was out of the helmet vision. So once again, this kind of helmet is a sort of sophisticated screen showing and hiding at the same time.
Thank you very much for your answer. And now, if there are some others that want to pose questions to Professor Carbone, we are here. Floriana?
Yes, okay. Yes, I would like to ask him something. So just today, during my talk on perceptual relations in digital environments, I referred to the difference between the object on a screen and the object in analogical environment. I also read, so I'm very interested on to what you said. I also read an interview in which you talking about your philosophy screen and of the difference of realities on different kinds of screen. You talked about variations on a theme, mentioning the Goldberg variations, defining the theme as an archy screen, maybe referring to Derrida's concept of difference as an archy structure, if I'm not wrong. So the question is this one: how can we interpret experience on the digital screen during pandemic, just as another variation on a theme, or as a radical restructuring of the theme itself, since the experience of pandemic takes the risk of making us very far from the social reality, from the analogical social reality. Maybe it's better to specify this. So I'd like you to clarify this point. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, you are asking many questions at the same time. First of all, the notion of archiscreen. The notion of archiscreen, you correctly suggested that echoes Derrida, and this is absolutely true. But at the same time, the characterization of this notion of archiscreen as a musical theme comes rather from Merleau-Ponty's characterization of theme in his lectures about natures. I edited the Italian translation of those lectures, and I thought that this idea of an archiscreen, of a theme in a musical sense without any previous direct presentation of the theme itself. A theme which shows itself just indirectly through its own variations, could be a good way of avoiding any temptation of developing a teleological philosophy of screen history. Example of this teleological way of thinking about screens. The idea that at the beginning screens were just hiding, now screens are just displaying. This is a teleological way that I want to avoid, and I think that the notion of archiscreen understood in that way can help us to avoid this theologism. Second question, in a sense, the experience, what is the experience of screens in pandemic is the meaning of my presentation tonight, that is to say, this idea that we lived a strange sort of phenomenological epoche. And this is a point that I would like to stress, because we study phenomenology and we read all the time what is an epoche. Is an epoche really possible? Is an epoche something we can decide to practice, or the practice of an epoche is something that happens forcing us? I tried to suggest in this second direction. The epoche is something that we can experience, but there is a shock that has to force us to think and to see things differently. Third questions, a radical, as was the word you said, maybe now we are facing a radical changement. I think that this changement, in any case, will be a variation, maybe a particularly strong and displacing variation, but still internal to the possibility of thinking it through the notion of archiscreen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks again. I don't know if there are other questions. No? Okay.
First of all, thank you for your lectio magistralis. Before you mentioned the concept of illusion, I didn't understand your idea of illusion. Is there a kind of dichotomic relation between illusion and reality? And in this case, where is the reality? So could you clarify your idea of illusion, please?
Yes, thank you, Luca, for your question, because actually this is a point that I would like to clarify. When I spoke about illusion, it was not my own concept of illusion. I spoke of illusion in a slide in which I was criticizing an old metaphysical dichotomy, according to which we would be able to separate something that we call reality from something else that we think to be an illusion. This is the natural attitude, it's not my own position. The idea of illusion as opposed to the idea of reality is at the base of this metaphysical prejudice which opposes reality to appearance in some epochs, to imaginary in other epochs, to virtual in other epochs, thinking that virtual, imaginary, or appearance are illusion with respect to something else, which is supposed to be reality. This is, in my opinion, a very hard to criticize the prejudice, and I think that it is still alive, and that we can trace it in behind the many critical attitudes with respect to screens. Let's stop with screens. Come back to reality. This is one of the slogans we can read. The dad is awful. Let's come back to reality. I totally disagree with this position, and I think that we have to overcome this kind of prejudice and posing ourselves once again the question, what is reality for us today? In my opinion, this is a very crucial problem. Let me remind you the first interview that Obama gave to BBC after the end of his presidency. He said that the risk is that each of us has his or her own reality. So this is our problem today. I think that what happened in Washington in January 21 was a concrete experience of this idea of a explosion of a shared notion of reality, and one of our most urgent goals today is to work in order to establish a new shared notion of reality, including the fact that we are in a digital era. So the digital has not to be considered as a new kind of illusion to be opposed to a supposed concrete reality.
So let me thank again Professor Carbone for his time and his very beautiful and interesting talk. And I also want to thank the public. And let's see you tomorrow morning, I would say, at 10 p.m. in presence, but also online. You can follow the panel of tomorrow morning and then of tomorrow afternoon. Thanks again, and
thank you everybody, and see you soon.